Hello and good day to you. I want to welcome you to this episode of Functional Medicine for Real World Impact. Today we are talking about hypertension. It's an oh so common diagnosis. As many as 50% of adults here in the US meet the diagnostic criteria for hypertension. Practitioners well understand how to use medications in order to force the body to have lower blood pressure. Today, we're going to be diving deeper, though, beyond first-line treatment to manage the numbers and talking about 5 often overlooked or perhaps poorly misunderstood drivers and mediators of hypertension. Welcome to Functional Medicine for Real World Impact. This is where we explore how functional medicine is actually applied in real clinical practice, what it looks like beyond the theory, and how practitioners just like you can navigate complexity in real time. Today's conversation is designed to give you practical insight that you can take into your own work right away. If you find yourself wanting to go deeper, please explore our upcoming educational experiences at safm.link/join. So let's dive into today's conversation. First of all, hypertension is chronically elevated systolic or diastolic blood pressure. As I said, it's quite prevalent. And it is important to manage high blood pressure. It is a functional imbalance that perpetuates itself. The increased mechanical and oxidative wear and tear in our blood vessels increases the risk of cardiovascular disease. Those mechanical and chemical forces do damage to the lining of our blood vessels, especially our arteries, and they attract the atherosclerotic repair process. I call it that as a gentle reminder that our immune system is not just responsible for defense in the body. That's important for countering and getting rid of foreign invaders, whether it is some type of infectious driver or maybe a toxic driver. But our immune system is also responsible for tissue repair. In fact, it is often a chronic, unrelenting wear and tear damage in the lining of our blood vessels that is attracting the well-intended but disease-promoting process of atherosclerosis. Vascular wellness in our blood vessels, again, especially in our arteries, is a measure of responsive, adaptive, balanced dilation or widening of our blood vessels and constriction or narrowing of our blood vessels. In our arteries, it's largely the biochemical nitric oxide that's mediating dilation. So we want to be good, ready, responsive producers of nitric oxide. And constriction is being largely mediated via angiotensin II, which is driven by a number of other biochemicals. And we want to have that constriction to drive higher blood pressure when it's necessary, when we are moving and lifting and acting and striving, perhaps when we are protecting ourselves, when we want to be in more of a sympathetic nervous system state. It's not about always being in a state of lower blood pressure. What we want to have is responsive, adaptive vascular wellness, where elevated blood pressure is not chronic, is not unrelenting. It's something episodic. And we also have appropriate dilation, especially overnight, that allows tissue repair and vascular wellness over time. Indeed, hypertension is common. Many patients are using 2 or even 3 medications to control it, which is appropriate and well-intended first-line therapy. However, most often in conventional care, and sometimes even in functional or integrative care, the underlying origins of hypertension are not being addressed. They may not be sufficiently assessed, and they're not being resolved and potentially not even controlled. these patients on multiple medications essentially end up with polypharmacy that is protecting the arteries in the short term. The numbers look better, but there is not resolution of the drivers and the mediators of the imbalance. We essentially here point to the difference between controlled physiology versus healthy vascular biology. So our opportunity as progressive practitioners is to identify and resolve the contributors to this dysfunction in a unique individual. So let's dive into the 5 often overlooked factors at play here. The first of them has to do with the why of hypertension. We often think about hypertension being just badness. It's functional imbalance that is harmful without necessarily thinking about why would the body be creating hypertension on purpose? Why would blood pressure be elevated all the time on purpose? Think about it for a moment. This is a good reminder that elevated blood pressure is the body's attempt to maintain optimal tissue perfusion. And if the tissue itself is struggling to be well nourished, right, to accept and make good use of optimal nutrient delivery from the blood, then the body is naturally, from a compensatory adaptive perspective, it's naturally going to increase blood pressure. Now, when we use medications to drive the numbers down, that helps to protect the arteries. But what about the heart, the liver, the brain that may then, as a result, not get optimal oxygen, not get optimal nutrient delivery, not get optimal removal of waste products in circulation? This is a great reminder that the body is responding in adaptive ways that simply may become maladaptive or disease promoting over time. This is a great reminder of the leadership of Dr. Mark Houston, who has been teaching the functional medicine community for decades now, that hypertension is not a disease. It is a downstream expression of vascular dysfunction. That dysfunction can be caused by a rich variety and almost innumerable upstream factors. In many ways, though, the blood vessel itself is simply an innocent bystander. So in addressing hypertension through the functional medicine lens, yes, we want to protect the arteries, but that's just the very beginning. That's the initial 10%, if you will, of clinical engagement. We also always want to go further upstream and address the drivers and mediators for why the body is increasing blood pressure in each unique individual. So this is the first concept to keep in mind in all of your clinical engagement around hypertension. Now, the follow-on factors I want to talk about here really require a brief reminder about the endothelium, this precious endothelial lining in the arteries. In particular, I've already shared that nitric oxide is a primary mediator of vascular behavior and signaling in our arteries. And part of our challenge in maintaining optimal blood pressure is that nitric oxide synthesis tends to wane as we age. Part of that is via factors that are lifestyle mediated, nutrient mediated, that we absolutely can control. I'm going to talk about some of those in just a minute. But it's also true that living and breathing, existing, even in a very healthy state in this life, in this body, generates lots of oxidative stress, a lot of pro-oxidative biochemicals and free radicals. And so our antioxidant capacity is challenged as we age. In particular, I want to make sure you are aware of a key part of our anatomy called the Glycocalyx. This is a thin gel-like lining on the inside of our blood vessels that acts as a protective interface between the constantly moving, surging bloodstream and the vessel wall. This helps to regulate vascular tone and fluid balance, and also helps to manage the effects of inflammation. And so the glycocalyx also needs to be protected over time. And when it becomes damaged, then our nitric oxide signaling declines. And we end up with endothelial dysfunction, where the vessels cannot readily flex between dilation and constriction, and help us to mediate our life, help us to function optimally. This is where we can end up with more of a chronic hypertensive state. So let's start to talk a bit more about some of the major mediators of this endothelial dysfunction. And the first of them that I want to talk about is metabolic disease. This is, you likely know, a common coincident diagnosis with hypertension. You're likely familiar that high blood sugar can create a lot of oxidative wear and tear on that glycocalyx, on our nitric oxide function. And many individuals with type 2 diabetes also struggle with hypertension, where arteries have become less responsive. And this is a major mediator, by the way, of the strong tie between progressive type 2 diabetes and the development of atherosclerosis, the progression to cardiovascular disease, or what we often term cardiometabolic disease. But it's important to remember that the origin, the early stages of that cascade does not start with high blood sugar. We can catch and resolve much, much more hypertension if we engage in the early stages of metabolic disease. We teach at SAFM that a time before blood sugar starts to raise at all may persist in an average adult for 5, 10, 13, 15 or more years. This is a time during which blood sugar may actually be optimal. You're not going to see any abnormality in fasting glucose or in hemoglobin A1C. In fact, you will often see these markers get lower before they become higher. This is a time during which our glycemic load of our lives, driven perhaps by our diet, the standard American diet, lots of refined food intake, especially refined carbohydrates, perhaps excessive carbohydrates relative to our exercise, our movement, right? Our glucose disposal, if you will. We end up with a high glycemic load that the pancreas, just like we were talking about before, the body is adapting in a compensatory fashion to the demand of our lifestyle. When our glycemic load goes up, the pancreas adapts by simply producing more insulin. This progressive adaptation can actually last for years and years and years. But if we're not checking fasting insulin or fasting C-peptide, we won't see this stage 2, early stage of metabolic dysfunction. Many practitioners don't know that elevated levels of insulin themselves will create endothelial dysfunction. Yes, even when blood sugar is optimal, or blood sugar might actually even be a bit lower. As adaptive fasting insulin gets higher and higher and higher, this can actually make your patients more vulnerable to episodic hypoglycemia. In fact, you might notice that someone's eating a standard American diet, they're not very active, and you're surprised that their hemoglobin A1C is as low as it is. Instead of thinking they just got lucky, right? They won the genetic lottery. We want to do a deeper dive. I would recommend we always check fasting insulin or fasting C-peptide as part of an annual physical so that we can see the early stages of subclinical elevation in fasting, in these fasting markers and intervene to reduce the glycemic load, then the pancreas will stop producing so much insulin in an adaptive fashion. But elevated levels of insulin all on their own can cause an imbalance in electrolytes, right? Where it can promote more sodium retention, which, as we know, over time can drive elevated blood pressure. The elevated insulin levels that can start to create insulin resistance can also reduce our nitric oxide synthesis in the lining of our blood vessels. And we can also end up with higher stress hormones through the action of hyperinsulinemia, even when it's subclinical. So these are dynamics you want to be thinking about. And so that we can engage with people to take a deep look at their diet, at their stress levels, at their movement, their activity, their exercise, all of these things that are affecting glycemic load and glycemic utilization, so that we can help them to come back into a better functional balance. So always think about the early stages of insulin resistance, even when blood sugar is seemingly optimal, so that we don't miss this early opportunity to prevent progressive hypertension. The third point that I would like to talk about is the effects of stress. My goodness. Autonomic imbalance is a common mediator of hypertension. And you know, as a seasoned practitioner, that our nervous system is designed, again, to have an adaptive, flowing, responsive balance between a sympathetic nervous system and a parasympathetic nervous system. So that when we need to, we can fight, flight, hide, fawn, in order to promote survival. That's a critical skill and a wonderful adaptive function of the body. However, we need to live in such a way that the lion's share of our time is in a parasympathetic state, which supports resting, digesting, healing, replenishment of biochemicals, fertility, detoxification, immune function for resolving infection, lots of things that are about promoting vitality. Many of your patients are struggling with debilitating and frustrating symptoms, not because there's anything wrong in the body, but because they are living in a way that is perpetuating more of a chronic sympathetic nervous system state that naturally drives biochemistry that doesn't support what they're seeking in an experience of vitality. The behaviors, the body response that comes only from parasympathetic activation in the body. And so we want to be looking for where there are drivers of this chronic sympathetic nervous system state. We can talk to patients and clients about their stress. We can teach them about how the body, if it perceives we're being threatened and we may not survive, we may have to fight, we may have to defend ourselves, the body's naturally going to increase your blood pressure. Not because it's broken, but because higher blood pressure promotes survival in those circumstances. But when it becomes a chronic state, this again can cause dysfunction. And this is where we also want to look for drivers and mediators of this autonomic imbalance that go beyond stress. Certainly, we want to talk to patients and clients about stress, trauma, hypervigilance, reactions to our life. This is a good reminder that our stress is often not so much about what's actually happening, the facts in our life, but more about our personal response to it. You and I could have the exact same circumstances in our life. You could be navigating it well, seeing it as part of the adventure of life, getting good support from your friends, having good behaviors like honoring sleep and good movement in order to help your body better deal with the stress. Meanwhile, I may not be navigating it well at all. In fact, I'm kind of living in my head and ruminating and hypothesizing about badness and making up stories and conversations in my mind that get me all agitated and geared up. This is a good reminder that the body is responding less to the circumstances in our life, and it's taking cues from our response to our life on what it needs to be prepared to navigate. This is critical to cover in your clinical sessions. However, what is often overlooked are physiological stressors that can also be perpetuating a chronic sympathetic nervous system state. And these are situations where your client may be honestly saying, I don't feel stressed. I'm doing all the things. My life is great. I'm full of gratitude. I experience joy regularly. I love my life. They may be speaking quite authentically to you about their experience, but behind the scenes, there may be physiological stressors of which they are simply not aware. And this is where we want to do a deeper dive clinically. And in particular, I want to encourage you to assess their sleep. Poor sleep, impaired sleep is a common silent, if you will, driver of a perpetual sympathetic nervous system state. This might be driven by highly interrupted sleep, perhaps because of snoring or maybe sleeping with a restless partner or a pet, where we're constantly being interrupted and we don't experience much deep sleep, which is the most healing time for the physiology of the body, right? Below the neck in particular. REM sleep, which is a lighter state of sleep, is incredibly restorative to the brain and the central nervous system. But our body needs multiple episodes of deep sleep. And when we're frequently interrupted or we sleep lightly because we know our nervous system knows we're going to be disturbed, this can interrupt the quality of our sleep. People don't feel rested the next morning. Snoring, we think of as more of an annoying symptom, but snoring is evidence of the body being deprived of oxygen. And this is a major mediator of a autonomic imbalance over time. Obstructive sleep apnea is even worse. If you think about it, we may think about it as, again, an annoyance, a sleep interruption. However, from the body's viewpoint, we almost die multiple times during the night. Look keenly for undiagnosed sleep apnea, perhaps unassessed sleep imbalance. This is at play in promoting this chronic sympathetic nervous system state much more often than many practitioners suspect. There can also be other physiological drivers, in particular, a chronic simmering infectious dynamic. Maybe when people have a lot of stress going on, mental, emotional stress, they're living in this sympathetic nervous system state, and the body is able to corral an infection, but it's not able to fully resolve it. This can also keep our stress hormones perpetually elevated. But I want to encourage you to look for physiological sources of stress, because this is often at play. And we can help our patients to reestablish good autonomic imbalance. Part of that is about calming the nervous system on purpose and reestablishing that good circadian rhythm of sympathetic, parasympathetic response as well. Good daytime and natural sunlight exposure is important for establishing that rhythm. We can use mindful breathing, especially slow, nasal, extended exhalation breathing, in order to regulate our nervous system and create a parasympathetic response on purpose. We can help patients to cultivate gratitude on purpose. We can encourage them to do journaling, perhaps for just a few minutes. It doesn't have to be a big investment of time. Perhaps just a few minutes at the end of each day before turning out the light at bedtime, or a few minutes first thing in the morning after they get up, cultivating a glass half full perspective, if you will, on purpose, rather than a glass half empty perspective. And again, it's a great reminder that our choices are shifting our physiology on a regular basis. Many of your patients don't know that. They don't understand that. There's all sorts of nervous system regulating movement, whether it's yoga, not hot yoga, but a warm or mild, moderate yoga, Tai Chi, Qigong, meditative walking. There's various types of HRV type of training exercises like heart math. These are things that practitioners sometimes may marginalize because they seem almost too simple to have a major physiological impact. And nothing could be further from the truth. These are often critical for beginning to shift an entrenched physiological imbalance that patients are having a hard time finding their way out of. So this is the third critical point, right? Good functional care must necessarily do a deep investigation of stressors in a unique individual's life. Mental, emotional, social, for sure, that's important. Doom scrolling, my goodness, social media scrolling is a major source of stress for people, even if they don't recount it as being stressful. To our nervous system, that high repetition, high shifting, strong messaging is a major driver of sympathetic response. But we always want to be looking for physiological drivers of stress as well. The third mediator that I want to talk about gets more back to other things that can be damaging our glycocalyx. What can be promoting this loss of nitric oxide signaling that can lead to less responsive arteries? This often has to do with environmental or inflammatory burden. We want to think about both the endogenous and the exogenous drivers of inflammatory damage to the lining of our arteries. There are many potential mediators for this. This is a place in which toxicity, whether it is heavy metals like mercury or lead or various endocrine disrupting chemicals from our food, from our air, from our personal hygiene and beauty products that we slather on our skin, makeup, sunscreen, bug spray, all of these things that are just seriously chemical loaded. We absorb these into our body and they can wreak oxidative wear and tear on the lining of our arteries. And so lifestyle choices matter. Exogenous toxins can wreak havoc on the glycocalyx and on endothelial function. It is also true that endogenous toxins can wreak havoc, and often these originate from the gut. You've heard me teach many times that systemic disease, remote localized disease often begins in the gut. What's at play with the brain, with the heart, with the liver, with the left knee joint, with the right big toe, often has major mediators in the gut. And this has to do with our challenges in maintaining good gut barrier function. In a healthy gastrointestinal tract, we have mild and highly well-regulated permeability in the gut lining. This allows nutrients to get in and toxins to get out so that they can be excreted in our stool via bowel movement. But we can have loss of barrier function, progressive increases in that intestinal permeability that allows too much of the pro-inflammatory dynamics in the gut to seep into systemic circulation. In a normal, healthy gut, our immune system, the majority of which is housed in the gut, is constantly surveilling what's coming in and responding to foreign threats, responding to opportunistic overgrowths and threats from our normal, healthy commensal microbiome. There's a lot of activity happening in the gut revolving around immune oversight. The gut expects that. The immune system expects that as long as it is corralled in the gut. But when we have a loss of barrier function and what happens in the gut is not staying in there, it's seeping out into systemic circulation, then we end up with things like microbial debris, lipopolysaccharide, wreaking havoc, promoting damage on the glycocalyx of our arteries. What the gut would have well managed is now in systemic circulation and wreaking havoc on our blood vessels. What comes out into systemic circulation are also inflammatory mediators that originated in the gut, that now the systemic body is being hyperexposed to. This is where we need to take care of our gut if we want to take care of our cardiovascular system and our blood vessels. Never leave out the gut in your clinical assessment and priority in any clinical case you're supporting, not a single one, because the gut is nearly always involved in mediating chronic disease. Dysbiosis in the gut, lifestyle choices that are mediating permeability of the gut, poor digestive capacity that is leading excessive dietary fodder available to support overgrowths of microbes in the gut. These are often at play. But I want to highlight one element in this particular driver that is often overlooked. That is the mouth. In fact, we often treat the mouth almost like it's a separate part of the body, a different or arena of medical care via dentistry. But of course, that's not true. Physiologically, the mouth is the top of the gut, and what happens in the mouth doesn't stay in the mouth. The gut experiences downstream the imbalances that are at play in the mouth. And we can also have enhanced permeability via the gums, where the systemic body ends up struggling with inflammatory mediators that originate in the mouth that then go into systemic circulation. So appropriate oral hygiene and dental care is essential for taking care of the gut and therefore essential for taking care of our arteries. A pearl for you, a clinical pearl, is always asking your patients whether or not they use mouthwash. Any type of antimicrobial mouthwash may be decimating our population of nitric oxide producing microbes in the mouth. In fact, alcohol-based mouthwash has been shown to contribute to hypertension directly in published study. And any type of even natural mouthwashes that are antimicrobial by design can be at play here. We want to be taking care of our mouth and making sure that we are avoiding dental caries. This means that flossing, for example, as a way of getting rid of biofilm buildup and disrupting the terrain that can perpetuate dysbiosis in the mouth. This is great preventative care for hypertension. These are key nuances that you can learn to master in minimizing the risk of hypertension. So I covered 4 factors. The 5th one that I want to talk about goes to the oh so common topic of electrolytes. I'm sure you're aware that excessive sodium in the diet can indeed lead to sodium potassium imbalance that perpetuates hypertension. This is true almost never because your patient chooses to put a little sea salt on their food. Instead, what is at the root of that is the standard American diet, chronic high intake of highly refined or ultra refined foods that are loaded with sodium in an effort to give very cheap and refined ingredients some degree of flavor. This is where highly refined foods typically have lots of sodium, lots of sugar, and also often lots of artificial flavors, artificial sweeteners, artificial preservatives, artificial texturizing agents in order to make food more enjoyable than it actually deserves to be. We always want to assess diet and especially the refined nature of diet. But many practitioners are not aware of the fact that, yes, we need to change the diet, but potassium And the potassium to sodium or sodium potassium ratio is actually much more important. Potassium intake mediates dramatically the effect that sodium has on our dilation and constriction of blood vessels. This is where working on crowding out refined foods by increasing colorful plant foods in the diet, including those that are potassium rich, is a key part of interventions to prevent or resolve hypertension. We want to be boosting our potassium. In particular, the safest way to do that is via diet and via a rich diversity of colorful foods so that individuals can sustain better sodium, potassium, electrolyte balance. It's also key, however, to ensure that a person has optimal magnesium status. Magnesium is a bit of a master electrolyte, and it is only via the effects of magnesium that we get cellular uptake, optimal cellular uptake of all that potassium so that the cells lining our blood vessels can actually function optimally. It's not enough to consume the potassium. We have to get it into the intracellular environment. Magnesium is essential for this. And all the things I've discussed today, high levels of stress, insulin resistance, chronic simmering infectious dynamics. All of these can cause loss of magnesium. These types of stress states, whether they're mental, emotional, or biochemical, these increase the loss of magnesium from our cells brought into circulation, which then promotes greater loss via the kidneys. So we want to be addressing the root causes, but very often magnesium is the most important supplemental nutrient that pre-hypertensive or hypertensive patients can take because we need to optimize magnesium. It is increasingly less prevalent in our diets, and our behaviors are more and more commonly promoting excessive loss of magnesium. Even though we consume it, we're promoting the loss of it. And again, we've got to get the magnesium into our cells in order for it to do the electrolyte balancing work that we count on it to provide. So there you have it, 5 commonly overlooked factors, drivers and mediators and principles related to hypertension. We want to protect the arteries, but that alone via allopathic care is never enough. Think about that as the initial 10% of hypertensive care. Practitioners of all modalities and focus areas can then dive in and do a deeper investigation of this unique person and keenly ask, who is this person and what does it play in their life system that is causing the body to choose hypertension, so that we can address the roots and allow the body to restore optimal functional balance. Thank you so much for being with me. I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you for joining us today. At SAFM, we believe functional medicine is the future standard for resolving chronic disease. And we're committed to helping practitioners just like you build the skill set you need to lead that shift. If you feel called to continue expanding your functional medicine know-how, please explore our upcoming educational experiences at safm.link/join. And if you haven't already, please be sure to follow or subscribe so that you don't miss any of these future conversations. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the work that you are doing to minimize the burden of chronic disease.